Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Good morning and welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast. I am your host, Sarah, and today is Tuesday, May 23rd, 2017. We are covering the third assigned lectionary text for the week of May 21st, 2017. That is the sixth Sunday of Easter, so we are on to the second New Testament text today, and that today comes from the book of 1 Peter, chapter 3. I've been thinking about where I see resurrection. And, I have been asking you that during this season of Easter. Where do you see new life? Where do you see resurrection? And as I was thinking about what I might say for today, I thought back to a conversation I had yesterday over Skype. I had such a fun and it really felt life-giving, like a life-giving conversation over Skype yesterday. And I've been really busy lately with a lot of different things, and there's been a lot going on in my life, and with my husband and I, we've both been really, really busy with work and really busy with a bunch of other things, and I haven't been getting out and spending time with friends as much as I would like to. I did get to spend time with my friend Katie a couple weeks ago, as I mentioned, and then my fabulous conversation with Katie last week for the podcast. And again, I hope you checked out that episode because it was a lot of fun. But then yesterday, I had another conversation over Skype, and this one was it was so fun and so relaxing, and I felt really, really great afterwards. You ever have those conversations that when you're finished, you're just like, oh, thank you. I'm so glad that I had that moment in my day, that I had that moment today that really helped me focus my attention and reminded me that, life isn't all just the stress and the craziness and the things that we let ourselves get so focused on, So that for me is resurrection and new life sometimes, the reminder that I need to take some time to pay attention to those things and to create those spaces where I'm not just completely stressed out about things and worried all the time, etc., etc. So that was my resurrection moment, and that was yesterday, and I really appreciated it, and I'm so glad that I had it. I hope you have had some resurrection moments in your life of late. I hope you've had some signs of new life popping up in your life, and that you have seen signs of hope, or however you are identifying or defining resurrection moments in your life. And if you've been paying attention to those, I would love to hear about them. So, as I said, this is the third of our four-part episode for the sixth Sunday of Easter, and we have moved to the second New Testament reading. Remember, there are two New Testament readings during this season of Easter because we have a selection from the book of Acts in place of the Old Testament reading during this season. And so, as I said, today's reading is from 1 Peter. We are continuing our journey through the book of 1 Peter. We're moving into chapter 3 today. So our reading is 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 13 through 22. And those verses are as follows. Now, who will harm if you are eager to do what is good? But even if you do suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear, and do not be intimidated, but in your hearts sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence. Keep your conscience clear so that when you are maligned, those who abuse you for your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah, during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were saved through water. And baptism, which this prefigured, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers made subject to him. So again, that is our reading assigned for this week. It is from 1 Peter 3, verses 13 through 22. And what did you hear in those verses? Was there anything surprising to you? Anything troubling to you? And for me, it's another text about suffering. If you joined me yesterday for the podcast on Psalm 66, that also talked about suffering and whether or not suffering comes from God and how we figure that out. And so when and this is a theme of this week's lectionary text, which makes me sigh a little bit because as a pastor or as a preacher or as a podcaster, whatever it is, when I see texts like this, I want to kind of run away. I don't want to talk about them. I don't want to, I want to ignore them. And I think we feel that way sometimes about things that are difficult. And of course, ignoring something will never actually make it go away. Darn it. I wish, it's sometimes, why couldn't it just be that easy, right? Unfortunately, ignoring this text won't make it go away. It's still going to be there. It's still going to pop up in the lectionary once every 3 years. And, it's still going to be there as I read through the Bible. And so you can't just will away or wish away the verses or the texts or even the entire books that make you uncomfortable. So, as I said, I'm not thrilled that we have yet another text talking about suffering, although it's not surprising because 1 Peter was already going in this direction in last week's text. So, oh, that was weird. My computer just made a noise. So I just got a pop-up message. Sorry about that. Right in the middle of me talking about suffering. So it's an odd moment. But one thing that did pop out at me, well, a couple things besides the suffering did pop out at me from these verses today. And that is, one of those is, it says, now who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? But even if you do suffer for what is right, you are blessed. And so there we have the suffering. But verse 14b, following what I just read, do not fear what they fear. And again, we've been plopped down right in the middle of chapter 3. We're starting with verse 13. So we don't necessarily know what that is referencing. Do not fear what they fear. But that jumped out at me. Do not fear what they fear and do not be intimidated, because there are so many places in the Bible that talk about, don't be afraid. God says that all the time. Jesus says that all the time. Don't be afraid. And then the other part that jumped out at me was that one more reference to the right hand of God, and we talked about that a few weeks ago. The right hand of God being, the acts of salvation, referencing those acts. And once again, Jesus is referenced as being at the right hand of God, of course, in reference to his death and resurrection, but now it's talking about salvation and baptism and all of those things. And so all of those salvific acts through the resurrection of Jesus, who's now at the right hand of God. So those are a couple of the things that popped out at me. Now, as I said, I was curious about this phrase in verse 14b, do not fear what they fear, and I was curious about what they might refer to. So I went back and looked at the verses directly preceding these, and this is verses 8 through 12, the verses directly in front of what we just read, and those are as follows, and if you're curious. Finally, all of you have unity of spirit, sympathy, love for one another, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. It is for this that you are called, that you might inherit a blessing. For those who desire life and desire to see good days, let them keep their tongues from evil, and their lips from speaking deceit. Let them turn away from evil and to do good. Let them seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. So that is verses 8 through 12, the verses directly preceding the ones that we read. And then that verse 13 starts in with, now who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? And we're going to talk more about these verses and the verses that are assigned for today, but we first do need to take our first break, so stay tuned and I will be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast. We are discussing this week's assigned text from 1 Peter chapter 3, and I just read the verses that are preceding the assigned verses. And these verses make a lot of sense if you remember the context of 1 Peter, if you remember that they are written to the communities in Asia Minor, communities who were forming new churches, but they were formed of people who were often outcasts in their society. They were often seen as lesser in their society, and so you can see that there's clearly a lot going on in their world. They're probably suffering in many ways, whether that's physical suffering or emotional suffering, or just all the various ways that they would have suffered being outsiders in their own community. And you can imagine that there would have been a lot of varieties of suffering for these groups of people. And so this letter is written as encouragement. And so you can see, I really like these. Do not repay evil for evil. Do not, let them seek peace. Let them pursue good. And so even in the face of this suffering, it's not saying, ignore the suffering. It's not saying embrace the suffering. It's saying instead of turning on your persecutors and giving them the exact same treatment, rather put that energy into doing something good. In the society they were living in, they didn't really have any power anyway. They didn't have power to change the system in which they were living, so they couldn't really do much about the persecution, the suffering that they were in, but you can only control what you can control, right? So I see this as it's not terribly encouraging that they can't change their circumstances, but the author of 1 Peter seems to be saying, control what you can control. Try to do good in the world. Try to make your little corner of the world a better place. Seek peace. Go out and do good in the world. Just find these places to do these things. It's, those who desire life and desire to see good days is in one of the verses in verse 10. And that is... Well, that's good advice. It's good advice even if your life is good, right? If you're not suffering. I hope you're not suffering, but do control what you can control. If you can do something about the suffering, please do. Do not live in a relationship that is causing you to suffer simply because you think you need to be in it. No, we have ways and means of getting out of relationships that are harmful, and we thankfully live in a society where we can do those things. There is help available. So do not stay in a relationship where you are suffering. But if for some reason circumstances are beyond your control, there's still good that you can do in the world. If you are suffering because of physical ailments and, there's not much that you can do about that, that's so hard. And my prayers are with you in those circumstances. There's almost nothing worse than constant chronic pain. And that is not something that you can control. But what are the things that you can control? And I'm not trying to make light of a situation that is, if you are suffering from physical pain, I'm not trying to make light of that, but just to say, well, maybe what are the things that you can control? So it's maybe a different way of looking at suffering. And yeah, I'm struggling a little bit here. I apologize. I guess I'm always afraid of, I never want to offend anyone. I never want to hurt anyone's feelings. And that's probably not the best place to be in. If you're a podcaster, you should just say what's on your mind and to heck with the consequences. But I've never been really good at that. I always want to take in everyone's circumstances. I want people to be heard. I want people to feel welcomed. And so I always worry that inadvertently I might say something that is offensive or might sound trite, and that's never my intention. So let's get back to the text. I want to look at some of the commentary for this text today and see if we can get some context, because my study Bible has absolutely no notes on this section, which I found really interesting. The margin is completely blank for the verses that are assigned for today. So that's something a little weird and different, but we'll look at commentary from the same woman that we've been reading commentary for 1 Peter for the last couple of weeks, and that's Janine K. Brown, who is professor of New Testament at Bethel Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. And she says, and not surprising, that suffering is a central issue in the letter of 1 Peter, and it is a central focus of this week's lectionary text. She says, Peter has been bringing both words of hope and caution to his readers in the first chapters of the letter. They should act in ways that are honorable and holy, so that their neighbors and even family members have no reason to criticize them. The tension inherent in their situation comes to the fore in our passage, where Peter asks the question that seems to be plaguing his audience: who will harm you if you are zealous for good? And that is the translation from the Common English Bible, so the CEB translation. She continues, you see, these followers of Jesus in Asia Minor are on the receiving end of slander and malicious talk. The reason for this treatment is their allegiance to Jesus as the only Lord, in a context where withdrawing from temple worship of their former gods is tantamount to sedition. Into this difficult situation, Peter advises the followers to adhere as much as possible to the expectations of state and household. Submit to emperor and governors, because it's God's will that by doing good you will silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. So when Peter asks the question of 3:13, his audience could easily respond that they have been harmed precisely for doing good, for following their Lord in full allegiance. Peter asks the question, it seems, to call for an even deeper reflection on their situation. He will readily concede in the next breath that it is possible for his audience to suffer slander even as they live worthy lives. But he seems to want his readers and hearers to do a double check when this kind of external pressure comes their way. So here we have a little bit more context, right? And we knew some of this. We knew that the community was seen as a group of outsiders. You know, they had come from different backgrounds and they had left their beliefs of before, and now they are believers in Jesus. They have become Christians. They have become a new church, and they are they're being verbally attacked for their beliefs. They are being ostracized for their beliefs. And so one thing that the author of 1 Peter is telling them is, you're going to hear these words, but try not to make it worse. Try to make sure that you live under the laws, as even though you've changed your perception, your perspective on your religious beliefs, you still need to live under the laws of the emperor or the governors, and because that's God's will. And so this brings me to think of my own tradition, and of course that's what I'm most familiar with. Your tradition will have different teachings, and I appreciate that, but I share from my own tradition. And Martin Luther used to he wrote about uses of the law and the two kingdoms. And I am not an expert on the uses of the law. I know people who can just spout them off just by memory, tell you what they are. But the two kingdoms are really the kingdom, the earthly kingdom and the heavenly kingdom. Both come with their own sets of rules, right? And Martin Luther was very clear in pointing out that we still have to abide by the laws of our own government, right? We don't just... We have to abide by God's rules, but then we also have to abide by the laws of our government, except when those two come into conflict, and then God's rules take precedent. So we have to make those decisions. But Martin Luther always was clear to say, just because you are a believer of God and you follow God's rules doesn't let you off the hook for the secular rules, doesn't let you off the hook for the rules that have been made by the government, etc. But you have to live with those two kingdoms in tension, knowing that, you serve God, but you live under this set of earthly rules as well. And that sounds a little bit like what Peter is saying to them. They do have this new faith, they do have this new community, but they still have to live under the laws, under the rule of the emperor and governors, etc., because that is God's will. And he says, by doing good, you will silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. And it doesn't sound like doing good necessarily will silence the talk of foolish people. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. It seems like a very complex situation in which the community that First Peter is written to found itself in. We're going to continue more with this commentary, but we are going to take our second break of the podcast, so please stay tuned and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast as we conclude our 3 of 4 parts of this episode, talking about the text assigned for the 6th Sunday of Easter, and we are looking at the text from 1 Peter chapter 3, and we are also looking at some commentary by Janine K. Brown, talking about the central theme of suffering in this letter written to the communities of Asia Minor. So she says that this need for self-reflection, and she's talking about doing good, and not following the rule, not doing good and following the rules of the government around them would silence the foolish people. And she says, so when Peter asked the question in verse 13, his audience could easily respond that they have been harmed precisely for doing good, for following Jesus, for following God in this new church, in this their new lives. So she says that the need for self-reflection comes into even greater focus in verse 17, where the author wonders aloud about the incongruity of suffering for doing good, if this could possibly be God's will. And that goes back to yesterday, right? That goes back to what we were talking about with Psalm and, is God the cause of the suffering, etc., etc. She says Peter is bent on ensuring that the slander directed toward these Christians comes from their allegiance to Jesus and nothing else. So it's a little bit, it's kind of a fine line. It's a bit of a gray area, making sure that the slander is only because of their beliefs, not because of any other way that they are living that might cause them harm, cause them slander, give any room for any other harsh words. And that when you are a minority in any sort of situation, you have to work twice as hard as the majority, right? Just to get the same amount of respect and recognition. And that seems to be what this author is saying. They're not going to give up their belief in Jesus, but don't let any other opportunity for slander come upon you. Live your life as best that you can, as uprightly as you can, so that they have no other arrows to sling at you. They have no other barbs to come at you with. So Peter is, as I said, bent on ensuring that the slander directed toward these Christians comes from their allegiance to Jesus and nothing else. Pursuing allegiance is a central exhortation of this passage. Set Christ apart as Lord in your hearts. And that is from verse 3, chapter 3, verse 15, the New English translation. Set Christ apart as Lord in your hearts. In a world of many lords and gods, and this is a world where there was a belief in many, many different kinds of gods, the Petrine believers are to have only one Lord and are to be ready to speak to the hope they share in common with the community of faith. And by speaking of their hope respectfully, humbly, and honorably, they will remain above reproach even if they are slandered by neighbors and family members. The hope is held out that their honorable behavior will in the end put to shame those who slander them. So this isn't just a lecture. The author of Peter is trying to give them hope, right? There is this effort to give them hope in their lives where they're probably not seeing much because they are probably feeling very maligned and very frustrated that things are not going well. They did something that they felt was good. They learned about Jesus and they changed their life. They turned their whole lives around, and now they are being slandered. They're being maligned for this new set of beliefs, and that had to have been frustrating. That had to have been extremely difficult. So there are numerous interpretive difficulties. She continues on. She says, in the rest of 1 Peter 3, Peter offers the example of Jesus to encourage his readers. Here he offers the narrative trajectory of Jesus' life to give them hope. As Jesus was vindicated after he had suffered unjustly, so these beleaguered followers of Jesus can look forward to vindication if they commit themselves to their faithful creators and continue to do good. There are numerous interpretive difficulties in these verses, most notably the identity of the disobedient and imprisoned spirits. Yeah. Did you catch that? That was a little strange, right? The nature of Christ's preaching or proclamation to them, and the source or rationale for the analogy between Noah's situation and the Petrine context. An answer to these three significant textual questions comes from the Jewish apocalyptic book, 1st Enoch, which dates from about the 2nd century BCE. In Enoch 6 through 16, we hear an expanded interpretation of Genesis chapters 6 through 9 in its narration of the exponential growth of human sinfulness and the subsequent flood, which only Noah's family survived. In 1st Enoch, the Nephilim, from Genesis 6 verse 4, now called the Watchers, give birth to evil spirits, who bring great wickedness upon the earth. That is the impetus for the great flood. Wow, isn't that fascinating? Maybe you already knew this. Maybe you have actually read 1st Enoch. I have not, I don't believe. So I didn't know about this expanded explanation or this expanded interpretation of the story in Genesis, especially this story of the flood. I am going to do more research on that, and I wish I had had time to do more research before I actually did the podcast, but unfortunately time got away from me today. But that's something that I want to look into, and you may want to look into it as well. I don't know. So the author of 1 Peter seems to draw on this expanded telling of sin and flood from Enoch to assert Christ's proclamation of victory over all evil, including these spirits, quote-unquote, in prison, a picture of God's patient restraining versus destruction of them. Christ's victory over death brings his full lordship over all angels, authorities, and powers, including these spirits who epitomize evil. Because of his resurrection, his vindication, those who trust Jesus can be assured that they, like Noah's family, will be rescued through water, an analogy for Christian baptism. If, as it is quite possible, the readers of 1 Peter knew these Enochian traditions, then in 3:18 through 22, they hear the story of Jesus' vindication after suffering and his removal of all contending powers. Jesus' storyline is meant to give hope that their own suffering will turn into vindication. So there is hope in these verses, right? The author is trying to give them both advice and hope, trying to give them something to focus on, trying to help them through the difficult times in their life. And they are given hope through the example of Jesus, through the promises of baptism, just as we have been given hope through our own promises of of baptism, through the promises that God has made us, through the covenants that God has made with us, through all of those tangible things that we have in our lives of faith, such as the waters of baptism, such as the bread and the wine, and then the words that go with those tangible signs, the words that give us promise, the words that give us hope. So this is a text about suffering, and there are some difficulties in trying to really wade through some of it and figure out just what it's trying to tell us. But I do appreciate that both the text and then this commentary lead us to a place of hope. The suffering is still going to be there, but where do we find hope in the world? And that really is appropriate for this Easter season, right? Because as we start off each podcast, where do you find signs of resurrection? Where have you seen signs of new life? Where do you find hope in the world? And this text gives us, the suffering is still going to be there, unfortunately, because we live in a broken world. We are sinful human beings. The suffering is still going to be in the world. But where do you find hope? Where does the hope come to us in the world through the promises that we have been given through the death and resurrection of Jesus? And that seems like a really good place to leave you, right? So thank you so much for joining me as we talked about the readings from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 13 through 22. I hope that you will join me tomorrow when we move on to the gospel, and that is the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verses 15 through 21. So we are picking up a little further after last week's text from the Gospel of John. As always, you can find all of our podcasts at www.gsmcpodcast.com. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr. You can download the podcasts on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, all those fun apps where that you use for your mobile device. Again, thank you for joining me. Join me again tomorrow as we conclude this 4-part series. But in the meantime, please remember that you are a beautiful and beloved child of God. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.